Hi, my name is Betty Garcia Mathewson and I work with the Opening Doors Diversity Project. Today I come to talk to you a little bit about industrial agriculture. If you work with migrant farm workers, you really need to understand industrial agriculture. And to understand how industrial agriculture operates today, you really need to have a sense of where it came from. It's only with a historical perspective does any of it make sense. And so our first industrial agriculture in this country was really the slavery South, when we were the world supplier of cotton. And so when I'm talking about industrial agriculture, I'm talking about scale. I'm not talking about small family farms. I'm talking about the scale of an industry that provides food for a very large region of the nation as a whole, or even internationally, the globe, the world, just as we did with cotton. Okay, so a turning point for all U.S. workers was really in 1935. The National Labor Relations Act was passed. And in the words of Clete Daniels, Congress enacted the National Labor Relations Act in 1935 to protect the rights of employees and employers, to encourage collective bargaining, and to curtail certain private sector labor and management practices which could bring harm to the general welfare of workers, business, and the U.S. economy. So the passage of this act was a huge milestone in our country's ongoing class struggle that has been here since the beginning and continues to this day. And so in this political process, California industry was very involved. They were real leaders in that process, the large political debate, and connecting with legislators. And they talked about family farms and the idea that if your employee was your child or your brother or sister, there was family, and family really weren't employees. And so the rationale was that farms are not really employers because they employ family. They knew this wasn't real, but they knew that's what they needed to do, because in order for them to be successful, they did need to replicate a system such as the slavery South. That worked really well for a long time, but it was inconsistent with our nation's ideals, and so it couldn't go on indefinitely. They needed to replicate that system, and they were very clear. Because of that, they knew that they needed to use foreign labor. So in the Western United States, we have a long history of using foreign labor. In the Eastern United States, we've always used African Americans. And as descendants of slaves, as Americans, we have been socialized to be comfortable, or at least normalized, to see African Americans in oppressive conditions. And so when agriculture was excluded from the National Labor Relations Act, what happened was that in that debate, Southern farm owners were very clear, Southern legislators, in terms of voting, they needed to have the National Labor Relations Act exclude farm workers, but their reason was different. They needed farm workers to be excluded because they needed the difference between the white and black working people in the South to be maintained. The structure of racism allowed for white Americans who were in working conditions that were not as good to feel better about themselves because they were a little bit better than African Americans. That division needed to be maintained. And so both regions, the far west and the southeast, who were engaged in industrial agriculture for very different reasons, but for very important reasons to them, needed farm workers to be excluded, farm work. And so in this region, we have had, as I said, historically African Americans. We've also had in this region Jamaicans and Haitians who have come as H-2A workers. That's a contract between their country and the U.S. Department of Labor. Now, these workers actually have less rights and less flexibility, so it is again a workforce that's working in substandard conditions. Because what the National Labor Relations Act did for us is it created employment as we know it. The work week, disability insurance, breaks, all of those things came as a result of the National Labor Relations Act. So when people say Americans don't want to do farm work, as they don't, but they don't want to do farm work because they have a standard. We've been socialized since the mid-1930s to have certain things connected to our work. So in this area, as I've said, we've had Jamaicans and Haitians through H2A. In the 1960s, we had thousands of Puerto Ricans working in this region, and they were working in farms and canneries. Today, we really only see Puerto Ricans in canneries. We had Italian immigrants working in farm work in Western New York for a time from the time they first immigrated to the time we allowed Italian immigrants to become white. And we opened up employment for Italians. At one time in this region, Kodak is a large employer. Kodak wouldn't hire Italians or African Americans. When they started opening the employment up for Italians, they then stopped doing farm work. So throughout the 1980s, we saw a lot of farm workers from Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. All of these people were political refugees leaving unrest in their home countries that was a direct impacted by U.S. foreign policy at the time. And so in the late 1980s, we have all of this happening, and the people that were coming were not coming with documentation. In terms of the Guatemalans, the El Salvadorians. And then in the 1980s, late 1980s, when African Americans started calling, as they did every year, to make arrangements with the farmer they'd been working with to come back up, they were told not to bother, that they were hiring someone else. And what they were hiring is they were hiring Mexicans. And so they were hiring Mexicans because they were immigrants that weren't documented and that would be able to be paid less. Now, the agricultural industry has said that that's not the case. But in 2000, Philip and Massey did a wage gap study, and it was consistently shown that undocumented workers made less than documented workers, even on the same farm. So it really is about money. Now, to understand why Mexicans started coming to the eastern part of the United States in the late 1980s and the early 1980s, we again have to go back. So going back is about the Bracero Program. In 1948, the U.S. and Mexico entered into a binational agreement, and it was a labor agreement that allowed for U.S., what it gave the United States was our agricultural system was in desperate need of workers. Our society was changing, people were moving from rural communities to cities, and we're not seeing farm work as something that they would be doing so much anymore. In Mexico, the government was really worried about political unrest. They had a range of poor rural communities across the country with no real economic structure that could support the communities. And so what it allowed the Mexican government to do was to ignore their poor communities because they could send a worker up north, get money, and come back. So in this time, this agreement really worked for both countries. During this 22-year period, it was from 1948 to 1962, the U.S. government recruited and brought people over to work. Farmers recruited and brought people over to work. And so during that 22-year period, there were 5 million people who crossed the border from Mexico to the U.S. legally with documentation to work on farms. During that same 22-year period, there were 5 million people who crossed over, recruited by farmers to work without documentation. And so the flow was not impacted by documentation. In fact, growers were really frustrated with the bureaucratic process, and so a few years after the bill was enacted, the Immigration and Nationality Act was passed. It was passed in 1952. And so 4 years after the Bracero Program was passed, and we had started getting all of these workers from Mexico, and it became clear to farmers that they also needed to be able to avoid the bureaucratic system and bring people in without documents. What the act did was made it legal to hire an undocumented immigrant by making it illegal to prosecute a farmer who hired and employed one. And so all of these system structures coming together created a route for workers to come without legal documentation. And so that when the system was closed down in 1962, The structural interdependence between our two countries was already created, and nothing had changed. There was still a dependence in the U.S. for the labor, and there was still dependence in Mexico for the U.S. dollars. And so after the Bracero Program ended, what we really had was pretend immigration enforcement. The program was ended. People continued to come because, as we said, the same number of workers, a generation of people, were socialized to think in the U.S. that farm work wasn't for them. And generations of people in Mexico were socialized to believe that going north for money was the way to establish yourself in your community. Go to the U.S., earn money, come back, build a house. And so I actually have heard multiple stories, but one was a director told me that they were having a fiesta, and so they had a lot of farm workers there. There was an immigration raid, and they actually took a busload of people who were undocumented out with them. And it was really no big deal. People just waved goodbye. They knew they'd come back in a little while. It was not a big deal. It wasn't until 1986 that things started changing. And what happened was the Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed. And so what that does was, it was a carrot and a stick kind of policy. Our immigration policy is an absolute mess. We can only get to this level of stupid in our immigration policy if you have two opposing sides completely determined never to come to common ground. So what we end up with, the carrot was amnesty, and that made some people happy to give people who'd been doing farm work amnesty. And then the stick was increase border patrol and shut down the route so that we'd have less people crossing. That made another group of people very happy. And so the opposing extremes got what they wanted, and what we got from IRCA through tougher border patrol was really shutting down the historic routes that people came through. People came through cities, Ciudad Juarez, Tijuana, Laredo. These border towns, people would just go to the border town. Half of the town was in Mexico and half of the town was in the United States, and they would come that way. It was really not that big of a deal. When the government shut down the cities and just made it impossible for people to pass, they knew they'd come through the desert and they knew people would die. And people do. And so with that increased border control, an outcome of that is that people don't go back and forth so often because you risk your life. And before IRCA, we had a pretty balanced number of Mexican people coming back and forth for work every year. People arriving, people leaving to go back home with what they'd earned to either build a house, start a business, send their children to school. And so, yes, people are staying longer. Now with Amnesty, people were able to send for their spouses and their children. And that's when families started coming. Prior to this, it was just the worker who would come. It wasn't the entire family. But if you have amnesty and you're going to resettle, the entire family comes. And so the Eastern migrant stream was impacted. IRCA happened in 1986. It was in 1988 and in the early 90s that the Eastern migrant stream started transforming because we had these workers that weren't going back home. We also had additional workers. Because systems can be corrupt, there were corrupt growers who sold people documentation to prove they had worked. There were people who never did farm work who got amnesty, and there were people who didn't do enough to have met the requirements. So we had more people who were given amnesty than actually were eligible. And so this increase in availability of workers had people start moving from the west, where they have historically used immigrants, then to the east. So now we're back in the late 1980s, early 90s, when African Americans were calling north to speak to their farmer they'd been working with for years and told that the job was no longer available. Now, these immigrants have been settling in our community now for a couple of decades. They've been here. More people from their communities have come. As all immigrant groups, the person who comes from an area becomes the bridge once they're settled between their new community and their home community. So we have immigrants from specific communities really clustered together in a way that we historically have since people have been immigrating to the U.S. Now, the last major historical event that has impacted the lives of migrant farm workers is 9/11. 9/11 happened, and the anti-immigrant hysteria has only increased over time. That has absolutely been impacted. The anti-immigrant hysteria has also been impacted by the economic recession we're in. And so whenever we have an economic recession, we no longer want immigrants here because there's a sense of them taking our jobs. So those two forces combined have had an impact on the real hate that people experience. So that's one impact of 9/11, is this incredible sense of hate that people feel coming to them through the media from hostile people in community. Children feel this, the parents feel this. People live really isolated lives. One aspect is hate. The other aspect is the incredible amount of enforcement and deportation of farm workers. And so we have ICE, the immigration agency, parking and sitting outside laundromats, grocery stores, churches, and looking to pick up people and deport them. We have families that are working really hard to just work and come home and hide. This has an impact on people's health, on their quality of life, the stress that living in that kind of environment provides. And so the bottom line is that the people doing farm work in the United States are low-income, underclass of workers who live a very hard life. And so who do we see in the migrant stream today? We do have, after the hurricane in Haiti, we saw more Haitians on our migrant stream. Recently, the U.S. government agreed to resettle Burmese immigrants that were pushed out of Burma because of ethnic cleansing. And we now see Burmese immigrants in Western New York doing farm work. And so understanding that the people you serve are receiving services because their work does not support their families. So it's important to remember that the services that your organization provides migrant farm workers, yes, is a direct subsidy to the farm worker, and it's an indirect subsidy to the industry. The industry does say Americans don't want to do their jobs, and they're right. Americans don't want to do farm jobs because the labor law exclusions create the kind of work Americans won't accept. Because Americans do dirty jobs. In fact, if you look on cable, there's a program, Dirty Jobs. And you can see really hard, difficult, dirty work that Americans do. The difference is those jobs have benefits and they have a 40-hour work week and all the kinds of things that we just really take for granted. And so within the migrant service community, we have agencies that provide direct service, and we have agencies that have evolved really to create the systems, change in the system structure. So they're really focused on justice. And there are sometimes conflicts between agencies. And the one thing I need to share with you, if you're working in this field, is that whether you're giving service or you're an agency that's working for change, people need service. And so we need people saving drowning people. And systems need to change. And so we need other people walking upriver to see who's throwing them in. And so please cooperate with each other. As a whole, we need both. Enjoy your work. Yes, recognize that people are oppressed and have had a hard life and don't have a lot of choices around them. At the same time, they're resilient, incredibly brilliant people who are doing hard work so that their children can have better. Thanks.